Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Hindus, An Alternative History by Wendy Doniger, narrated by Amy Landon. Publisher's note: this audiobook refers to images included in the print and e-book editions of the book. Preface: The Man or the Rabbit in the Moon. An Alternative History. The image of the man in the moon, who is also a rabbit in the moon, or the duck who is also a rabbit, will serve as a metaphor for the double visions of the Hindus that this book will strive to present. Since there are so many books about Hinduism, the author of yet another one has a duty to answer the potential reader's Passover question. Why shouldn't I pass over this book? Or, why is this book different from all other books? This book is not a brief survey. You noticed that already. I had intended it to be, but it got the bit between its teeth and ran away from me. Nor, on the other hand, is it a reference book that covers all the facts and dates about Hinduism, or a book about Hinduism as it is lived today. Several books of each of those sorts exist, some of them quite good, which you might read alongside this one. The Hindus, An Alternative History, differs from those books in several ways. First, it highlights a narrative alternative to the one constituted by the most famous texts in Sanskrit, the literary language of ancient India, and represented in most surveys in English. It tells a story that incorporates the narratives of and about alternative people who, from the standpoint of most high-caste Hindu males, are alternative in the sense of otherness, people of other religions or culture, or castes or species, animals, or gender, women. Part of my agenda in writing an alternative history is to show how much the groups that conventional wisdom says were oppressed and silenced and played no part in the development of the tradition, women, pariahs, oppressed castes, sometimes called untouchables, did actually contribute to Hinduism. My hope is not to reverse or misrepresent the hierarchies, which remain stubbornly hierarchical, or to deny that Sanskrit texts were almost always subject to a final filter in the hands of the male Brahmins, the highest of the four social classes, the class from which priests were drawn, who usually composed and preserved them. But I hope to bring in more actors and more stories upon the stage, to show the presence of brilliant and creative thinkers entirely off the track beaten by Brahmin Sanskritists, and of diverse voices that slipped through the filter, and indeed to show that the filter itself was quite diverse, for there were many different sorts of Brahmins. Some whispered into the ears of kings, but others were dirt poor and begged for their food every day. Moreover, the privileged male who recorded the text always had access to oral texts, as well as to the Sanskrit that was his professional language. Most people who knew Sanskrit must have been bilingual. The etymology of Sanskrit, perfected, artificial, is based upon an implicit comparison with Prakrit, primordial, natural, the language actually spoken. This gives me a double agenda. First, to point out the places where the Sanskrit sources themselves include vernacular, female, and lower-class voices, and then to include, wherever possible, non-Sanskrit sources. The Sanskrit medium is not always the message. It's not all about Brahmins, Sanskrit, the Gita. I will concentrate on those moments within the tradition that resist forces that would standardize or establish a canon, moments that forged bridges between factions, the times of the mixing of classes, Varna Sankara, that the Brahmins always tried, inevitably in vain, to prevent. Second, in addition to focusing on a special group of actors, I have concentrated on a few important actions, several of which are also important to us today. Nonviolence toward humans, particularly religious tolerance, and toward animals, particularly vegetarianism and objections to animal sacrifice, and the tensions between the householder life and renunciation, and between addiction and the control of sensuality. More specific images, too, such as the transposition of heads onto bodies or the flooding of cities, thread their way through the entire historical fabric of the book, I have traced these themes through the chapters and across the centuries to provide some continuity in the midst of all the flux, even at the expense of what some might regard as more basic matters. Third, this book attempts to set the narrative of religion within the narrative of history, as a linga, an emblem of the god Shiva, often representing his erect phallus, is set in a yoni, the symbol of Shiva's consort or the female sexual organ, or any statue of a Hindu god in its base or plinth, pita. I have organized the topics historically in order to show not only how each idea is a reaction to ideas that came before, as any good old-fashioned philological approach would do, but also, wherever possible, how those ideas were inspired or configured by the events of the times, how Hinduism, always context-sensitive, responds to what is happening at roughly the same moment, not only on the political and economic scene, but within Buddhism or Islam in India, or among people from other cultures entering India. For Hinduism, positioning kings as gods and gods as kings seldom drew a sharp line between secular and religious power. In recent years, a number of historians of religions, particularly of South Asian religions, have contextualized particular moments in the religious history of the subcontinent. This book attempts to extend that particularizing project to the whole sweep of Indian history, from the beginning, and I do mean the beginning, circa 50 million BCE, to the present. This allows us to see how certain ongoing ideas evolve, which is harder to do with a focus on a particular event or text at a particular moment. This will not serve as a conventional history. My training is as a philologist, not a historian, but as a book about the evolution of several important themes in the lives of Hindus, caught up in the flow of historical change. It tells the story of the Hindus primarily through a string of narratives. The word for history in Sanskrit, itihasa, could be translated as "that's what happened," giving the impression of an only slightly more modest equivalent of von Ranke's phrase for positivist history, wie es eigentlich gewesen ist, the way it really happened. But the it in the word is most often used as the Sanskrit equivalent of end quote, as in, let's go, eat, he said. Itihasa thus implies not so much what happened, as what people said happened. That's what he said happened. Narratives. Inevitably subjective narratives. And so this is a history not of what the British used to call maps and chaps, geography and biography, but of the stories in history. It's a kind of narrative quilt made of scraps of religion sewn in next to scraps of social history. A quilt, like those storytelling claws that Indian narrators use as mnemonic devices to help them and the audience keep track of the plot. The narrator assembles the story from the quilt pieces, much as the French rag-and-bones man, the bricoleur, makes new objects out of the broken-off pieces of old objects, bricolage. Like any work of scholarship, this book rests on the shoulders of many pygmies as well as giants. I have kept most of the scholarly controversies out of the text, after laying out the rules of the game in these first two chapters of methodological introduction and in the pre-Vedic period, chapters 2 through 4, which might stand as paradigms for what might have been done with all the other chapters, as well as a few other places where the arguments were so loony that I could not resist the temptation to satirize them. Many a fact turns out, on closer inspection, to be an argument. There is another story to be told here, how we know, what we used to believe, why we believe what we believe now, what scholars brought up certain questions or gave us the information we now have, what scholars now challenge that information, and what political factors influenced them. Those arguments tell a story that is interesting in itself, but to which I merely allude from time to time. I also write in the shadow of a broad scholarship of theories about religion and history, and I will keep that, too, out of the text. I have tried to avoid setting my opinions against those with whom I disagree, or using them as fall guys, beginning an argument by citing the imagined opponent. I have rather simply presented each subject in what I believe to be the best scholarly construction, in order to concentrate on the arguments about it within the Hindu texts themselves. Many crucial questions remain unanswered, and I hope that this book will inspire some people to go back to the sources and decide for themselves whether or not they agree with me. Sanskritization, dacification, and vernacularization. Sanskrit texts from the earliest period assimilated folk texts that were largely oral and composed in languages other than Sanskrit, vernacular languages. But even in the Vedic age, Sanskrit was not what has been called a kitchen language, not the language in which you said, "Pass the butter." Actually, Brahmins probably did say "pass the butter" in Sanskrit when they put butter as an oblation into the fire in the course of the sacrifice. But those same Brahmins would have had to have known how to say it in another language as well, in the kitchen. At the very least, those male Sanskritists had to be bilingual, in order to talk to their wives and servants and children. It was through those interactions that oral traditions got their foot in the Sanskrit door. Colonel Pickering, in George Bernard Shaw's Pygmalion, is said to be the author of Spoken Sanskrit, and many priests and scholars can speak Sanskrit. But no one ever spoke only pure Sanskrit. Sanskrit and oral traditions flow back and forth, producing a constant infusion of lower-class words and ideas into the Brahmin world, and vice versa. It must have been the case that the natural language, Prakrit, and the vernaculars came first, while Sanskrit, the refined secondary revision, the artificial language, came later. But South Asianists often seem to assume that it is the other way around, that the dialects are derived from Sanskrit, because Sanskrit won the race to the archives and was the first to be written down and preserved, and we only encounter vernaculars much later. So we say that Sanskrit is older, and the vernaculars younger. But Sanskrit, the language of power, emerged in India from a minority, and at first its power came precisely from its non-intelligibility and unavailability, which made it the power of an elite group. Walt Kelly's Pogo used to use the word Sam's scrimps to describe highfalutin double-talk or manipulative twaddle. Many Euro-Americans mispronounce it Sanskrit, implying that it is a language without, sans, an intelligible script, or sand script, with overtones of ruined cities in the desert or a lost language written in sand. The sociologist M.N. Srinivas, in 1952, coined the useful term Sanskritization to describe the way that Vedic social values, Vedic ritual forms, and Sanskrit learning seep into local popular traditions of ritual and ideology, in part through people who hope to be upwardly mobile, to rise by imitating the manners and habits, particularly food taboos, of Brahmins, and in particular avoiding violence to animals. Indian society, in this view, is a permanent floating game of snakes and ladders, or perhaps snakes and ropes, recalling that Vedantic philosophers mistake snakes for ropes, and that you can climb up on ropes in the Indian rope trick, which you enter in a state of impurity, gradually advancing over the generations toward the goal of Brahminical purity, trying to avoid the many pitfalls along the way. Tribal groups, Bhils, Gonds, etc., might undergo Sanskritization in order to claim to be a caste, and therefore Hindu. But the opposite of Sanskritization, the process by which the Sanskritic tradition simultaneously absorbs and transforms those same popular traditions, is equally important, and that process might be called oralization, or popularization, or even perhaps dacification from the local or desi traditions, or laukification, from what Sanskrit calls laukika, of the people, loka. Let's settle on dacification. The two processes of Sanskritization and dacification beget each other. Similarly, through a kind of identificatio Brahmanica, local gods take on the names of gods in Sanskrit texts. Marukan becomes Skanda, a kind of Sanskritization, while at the same time there is an identificatio Desika, by which Sanskrit gods take on the characteristics of local gods. And to people who worship Marukan, it is Marukan, who is absorbing skanda, not the reverse. Cross-fertilization might be a good equalizing term for the combination of the two processes. Written does not necessarily mean written in Sanskrit, nor are oral texts always in the vernacular. The Rig Veda, after all, was preserved orally in Sanskrit for many centuries before it was consigned to writing. We cannot equate vernacular with oral, for people both write and speak both Sanskrit and the vernacular languages of India, though Sanskrit is written more often than spoken. The distinction between Sanskrit and the vernacular literatures is basically geographical. Though there are regional Sanskrits, the vernaculars, unlike Sanskrit, are defined and named by their place of origin. Bangla, from Bengal, Oriya, from Orissa, and so forth. While the script in which Sanskrit is most often written allegedly has no particular earthly place of origin. It is called the script of the city of gods, Devanagari. Once people departed from the royal road of Sanskrit literary texts, there were thousands of vernacular paths that they could take, often still keeping one foot on the high road of Sanskrit. The constant, gradual, unofficial mutual exchange between Sanskrit and the vernacular languages, the cross-fertilization, underwent a dramatic transformation toward the middle of the second millennium. Local languages were now promoted officially, politically, and artistically, replacing the previous fashionable cosmopolitan and translocal language, Sanskrit. Instead of nourishing and supplementing Sanskrit, the vernacular languages as literary languages began to compete with Sanskrit as the language of literary production. This process has been called, in imitation of Srinivasa's Sanskritization, and in contrast with both desification and the more mutually nourishing two-way process of cross-fertilization, vernacularization, the historical process of choosing to create a written literature, along with its complement, a political discourse, in local languages according to models supplied by a superordinate, usually cosmopolitan, literary culture. Or, a process of change by which the universalistic orders, formations, and practices of the preceding millennium were supplemented and gradually replaced by localized forms. The great divide is between written and non-written, not between Sanskrit and the vernaculars, particularly as the Sanskrit corpus comes to be desified and the vernaculars eventually become Sanskritized themselves, imitating Sanskrit values and conventions, sharing many of the habits of the Sanskrit Brahmin imaginary, such as grammars and lexicons. The bad news is that some of the vernacular literatures are marred by the misogynist and class-bound mental habits of Brahmins, while the good news is that even some Sanskrit texts, and certainly many vernacular texts, often break out of those strictures and incorporate the more open-minded attitudes of the oral vernaculars. Many ideas, and in particular many narratives, seem to enter Sanskrit literature, either from parts of the Sanskrit canon that have fallen away, or from non-Sanskrit sources, two entirely non-falsifiable speculations. It's an old joke among linguists that a language is a dialect with an army, and this is sometimes used to explain the dominance of Sanskrit texts, since, as usual, the victors wrote the history, and in ancient India, they usually wrote it in Sanskrit. The earliest inscriptions were in Prakrit, not Sanskrit, but from about 150 CE, Sanskrit dominated this field too. Sanskrit is perched on top of the vernacular literatures like a mahout on an elephant, like Krishna riding on the composite women that form the horse on the cover of this book. Selectivity and synecdoche. Such a luxurious jungle of cultural phenomena, truly an embarrassment of riches, necessitates a drastic selectivity. I have therefore provided not detailed histories of specific moments, but one or two significant episodes to represent the broader historical periods in question. The result is not a seamless narrative that covers the waterfront, but a pointillist collage, a kaleidoscope, made of small, often discontinuous fragments. Synecdoche, letting one or two moments in history and one or two narratives stand for many, allows us to see alternity in a grain of sand, taking a small piece of human history and using it to suggest the full range of enduring human concerns. These small fragments alternate with a few exemplary narratives, quoted in considerable detail, where Hindus speak in their own words, in translation. I have tried to balance my translations of the classic, much-translated texts with citations of more obscure, previously unnoticed texts, using as my framework the usual suspects that scholars have rounded up over and over, the basic curry and rice episodes of Hinduism, but moving away quickly, in each chapter, to a handful of lesser-known episodes, things usually left out of survey books on Hinduism. These are not the great imperial moments, but episodes that give us an inkling of what religious life was like for some people, including ordinary people, in India long ago. I have also included a few episodes of interaction, both friendly and hostile, between Hindus and non-Hindus in India, such as Buddhists, Jainas, Sikhs, and Muslims, though without paying direct attention to those other religions in their own right. Beginning with a minimal backbone or infrastructure of basic historical events and concepts that many people would agree upon, data never value-free, but still valuable. We can then move from this point outward to other points, and from social history to literary texts, to search for narratives of and about alternative people. That selectivity makes this book alternative in another sense, in that it leaves wide open a great deal of space for others to select from in writing their histories, alternative to mine. Someone else would make different choices and write a very different book. This is a history, not the history, of the Hindus. Themes and variations. The central actors and their actions are threads around which the great narratives of Hinduism coalesce like crystals in a supersaturated solution. The actors and actions connect in various ways. Sanskrit texts usually regard women and hunted animals as primary objects of addiction, and the senses that cause addiction are likened to horses. Animals often represent both women and the lower classes. The tension between sexuality and renunciation results in an ambivalence toward women as mothers and seductresses, and violence is first addressed largely in the form of violence against animals. Violence and tolerance also interact in attitudes not only to other religions, but between the upper and lower castes, between men and women, and between humans and animals. I will highlight in each period those moments when intra-religious, including intercaste, or interreligious interactions took place, marked by either tolerance or violence, the deciding factor between the two options often being historical circumstances. Each chapter deals with several themes, but not every chapter has instances of every theme, or treats the same theme in the same way. Chapter 12, for instance, is about women more than about goddesses, while Chapter 14 is about goddesses more than about women. And indeed, I have often noted the activities of women in other contexts, without explicitly highlighting their gender. But wherever the evidence allows, I will organize each chapter around these central themes. Nonviolence. In the introduction, Chapter 1, I spell out the assumptions behind my attention to history and to the particular actors in this story: women, lower classes and castes, and animals. Here let me just say a few words about the central action, non-violence. The term nonviolence, ahimsa, originally applied not to the relationship between humans, but to the relationship between humans and animals. Ahimsa means the absence of the desire to injure or kill, a disinclination to do harm, rather than an active desire to be gentle. It is a double negative, perhaps best translated by the negative non-violence, which suggests both mental and physical concern for others. The roots of ahimsa may lie in Vedic ritual, in animal sacrifice, in the argument that the priest does not actually injure the animal but merely pacifies him. The primary meaning of ahimsa is thus to do injury without doing injury, a casuist argument from its very inception. In the Rig Veda, the earliest Sanskrit text from circa 1200 BCE, the word ahimsa refers primarily to the prevention of injury or violence to the sacrificer and his offspring, as well as his cattle. Book 10, Hymn 22, verse 13. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that the verb on which ahimsa is based, han, is ambiguous, meaning both to strike or beat and to kill. Ahimsa, therefore, when applied to cows, to take a case at random, might mean refraining either from beating them or killing them. Quite a difference. In any case, ahimsa represents not a political doctrine or even a social theory, but the emotion of the horror of killing or hurting a living creature, an emotion that we will hear attested from the earliest texts. Arguments about whether or not to kill, sacrifice, and or eat animals were often at the heart of interreligious violence, sometimes the grounds on which human beings attacked other human beings, usually with words, though occasionally with blows. Arjuna, the heroic warrior of the Mahabharata, the great ancient Sanskrit poem about a tragic war, excuses the violence of war by saying, "Creatures live on creatures, the stronger on the weaker. The mongoose eats mice, just as the cat eats the mongoose. The dog devours the cat, your majesty, and wild beasts eat the dog." Even ascetics, tapasis, cannot stay alive without killing. Book 12, Hymn 15, verses 16 through 24. The text here justifies human violence by the violence that is rampant in the animal world. Yet the most common sense of ahimsa refers to humans' decision to rise above animal violence. Vegetarianism, both as an ideal and as a social fact in India, challenges Arjuna's belief that animals must inevitably feed on one another, and attempts to break the chain of alimentary violence simply by affirming that it is not in fact necessary to kill in order to eat. Nonviolence became a cultural ideal for Hindus precisely because it holds out the last hope of a cure, all the more desirable since unattainable, for a civilization that has, like most, always suffered from chronic and terminal violence. Nonviolence is an ideal propped up against the cultural reality of violence. Classical Hindu India was violent in ways both shared with all cultures and unique to its particular time and place, in its politics, war being the raison d'etre of every king, in its religious practices, animal sacrifice, ascetic self-torture, firewalking, swinging from hooks in the flesh of the back, and so forth, in its criminal law, impaling on stakes and the amputation of limbs being prescribed punishments for relatively minor offenses, in its hells, cunningly and sadistically contrived to make the punishment fit the crime, and, perhaps at the very heart of it all, in its climate, with its unendurable heat and unpredictable monsoons. Hindu sages dreamed of nonviolence as people who live all their lives in the desert dream of oases. It is against this background that we must view the doctrine of nonviolence. The history of Hinduism, as we shall see, abounds both in periods of creative assimilation and interaction, and in outbursts of violent intolerance. Sometimes it is possible to see how historical circumstances have tipped the scales in one direction or the other. Sometimes it is not. In their ambivalent attitude to violence, the Hindus are no different from the rest of us, but they are perhaps unique in the intensity of their ongoing debate about it. The man, rabbit, in the moon. I have organized several of these tensions into dualities, for dualism is an, if not the, Indian way of thinking, as the folklorist A.K. Ramanujan pointed out, speaking of his father. I, in my generation, was troubled by his holding together in one brain both astronomy and astrology. I looked for consistency in him, a consistency he didn't seem to care about, or even to think about. "Don't you know," he said, "the brain has two lobes." But some of the most interesting developments take place in the combinations of the two cultural lobes, whether we define them as Brahman and non-Brahman, written and oral, or male and female. One medieval Hindu philosophical text defined a great teacher as someone with the ability to grasp both sides of an argument. It is, I think, no accident that India is the land that developed the technique of interweaving two colors of silk threads, so that the fabric is what they call peacock's neck, Blue if you hold it one way, green.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?